Hello and welcome back everyone to yet another lesson in web development. Today's lesson is all about PHP loops as well as functions. And much like any other programming language, this is extremely important. Now, let's have a look at the objectives for today's lesson. Now, the objectives for today's lesson is as follows. First, we'll start by exploring loops in PHP. And if you are familiar with JavaScript, one of our previous programming languages, and how loops work in that specific language, it won't be all that difficult to understand and grasp the concept of loops in PHP. Next, we'll move on to working with PHP functions, which is very, very useful in the event that we want to build a specific block of code and reuse that block of code. Again, much like in JavaScript. And then lastly, as always, we'll have a practical demonstration. Wonderful. Now with that being said, let's dive right into our very first topic and let's start with PHP loops. Now, what exactly are PHP loops? Well, like in most programming languages, often when you write a block of code, you want to be able to use that same block of code over and over and over. Instead of adding several almost equal lines of code in a script, we can use a loop to achieve this. Now, when it comes to the PHP programming languages, there are often four basic loops that we can opt for, and that is the for loop, the for each loop, the while loop, as well as the do while loop. Let's have a look at these loops in greater detail. Now, the for loop is often the easiest loop to understand, and this is often the case across various other programming languages. We've seen the for loop before in JavaScript, and essentially the for loop basically loops through a block of code a specific number of times. Let's have a look at the example. Now, over here we specify the for keyword, and we open our brackets, we specify our counter. We then specify the condition for that loop to carry on until that condition is met. And then we execute the code and then we increment our counter. Remember, our counter keeps track of the number of times that we are able to loop through a specific block of code. Now, one of the loops that really stand out in PHP is the for each loop. Unlike your basic for loop, the for each loop can really be a powerful tool when paired with an element such as an array. And basically this does the same thing. The only difference is that with the for each loop, instead of having a specified number of times that you want the loop to run, the loop will essentially exhaust the amount of indexes within an array. Let's have a look at a basic example. First, we specify the for each keyword, we then open our brackets, then we pass in the array variable, or just our array, as value, and value is what holds the index of that specific array at any given point in that array. We then execute the code. So for example, if we had an array of 10 indexes or an array from 0 to 10, the loop will essentially exhaust that array until every single index has been printed out or you've done some sort of computation with that index. Now, this is going to make a lot more sense when we have a look at an example. Now, the while loop is exactly that, and it's not that new to us. In fact, we've actually seen the while loop in action when working with JavaScript. Now, this loop loops through a block of code as long as the condition specified is true. So only once the condition is no longer met, it's then that the loop will actually stop running. Let's have a look at an example. So first we specify the while keyword, we specify the condition that is true, and the code continues to be executed until the condition is no longer true. That is to say, the condition is false, and that is when this loop stops executing. And then finally, we have the do while loop. Now, the do while loop loops through a block of code at least once, regardless of a condition being true or false. The block of code to be executed will at least run once, and then it will repeat the executing of that block of code as long as the specified condition is true. Let's take a look at another example. Now, over here we have the do keyword, and the do keyword just essentially says at least do this piece of code once and then check for the condition. And while the condition is true, then do the execution of that block of code again. And that is basically it for loops in PHP. I think it's time we get started with our next topic in mind, and that is working with PHP functions. Now, what exactly is a function in PHP? Well, like most other programming languages, a function is a piece of code which takes in one or more parameters known as inputs and does some sort of processing and returns some sort of value by the end of that function. Now, when it comes to working with functions in PHP, there are several things that we must be mindful of. The first is that besides the built-in PHP functions, and we've seen the likes of the echo function as well as the var dump function, we can also create our own functions. Now, functions can be used repeatedly within a script or a program. A function will not be executed immediately when the page loads or when the function is created. In order to use a function, we must call the function like in any other programming language. Now, we mentioned before that function can take parameters, otherwise known as inputs. Now, PHP gives you the option to pass your parameters inside a function. You can pass as many parameters as you see fit. These parameters work like variables inside of our function. The following example, which we'll have a look at, takes in two integer parameters and adds them together and then prints the result. So let's have a look at this example. So over here, we've got a block of code with some HTML and some PHP in between. And this is what our end result looks like. Essentially, we call the function keyword. This is how we create a function. We then give that function a name. In this case, this is called add function. We then specify that this function takes in two parameters known as num1 and num2. Notice that they are created as variables. We then run the block of code that is necessary for computation in this function. And in order to call this function, we have to actually call the function by saying add function and supply two parameters, which is 10 and 20. And the end result here is that we have an output of 30 as seen in our PHP functions with parameters. The result here is sum of the two numbers is 30. Wonderful. What about the return statement in PHP? Now, when it comes to functions, we can also add the return keyword, which gives us a lot more flexibility. A function can return a value using the return function in conjunction with an object or value. Return stops the execution of the function and sends the value back to the calling code. The following example takes in two integer parameters and adds them together and then returns the sum of the two numbers. Note that the return keyword is used to return a value from the function. Now, this is what our output looks like. We have some concatenated string that says return value from the function, which is 30. Let's have a look at the code in greater depth. Now, after we've created the function and we've specified that we require two parameters for this function, we create a new variable called sum. And sum takes in the num1 plus num2 values, and then we have this new thing called a return keyword. All this does is return the sum variable, which is going to be 30 after we call the function. And then we can assign that value to a new variable called return underscore value. Now, do keep in mind, you can call this whatever you want. Essentially, what's happening here is we are making this variable, or we are adding or assigning the function result to this variable, which is different from just creating a variable out of the box and assigning a value. We'll see how this works in greater detail when we actually tackle our demonstration. And speaking of which, it's actually time for our PHP practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's dive right in and let's start to code. Now, to get started, I'm simply just going to boot up Atom. And first things first, we need to ensure that our XAMPP service is running. So I'll head over to XAMPP control panel and I'll ensure that I have my Apache server started as well as my MySQL database. Wonderful. So we can actually minimize this now and move forward. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save this file as a PHP file. So I'll head over to my htdocs under my XAMPP, which is under my C drive, and I'm going to create a new file over here called l6.php. Great. So now we can actually start writing our code. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create some HTML boilerplate code. And I'm simply just going to add some text to the body over here. So I'll add an h2 tag. And this is simply just going to contain the text loops. Great. Now with that in mind, we can actually navigate to our browser and we can type in localhost, and I'm going to go / and I'll say PHP L6 PHP and I'll run my script. So I can actually see my text is displaying. So I know my server is running because everything is working accordingly. Now let's start writing our official PHP code with everything that we've learned so far. So I'll head back over. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a PHP tag over here. So I'll just say PHP and this is where I'll insert all my PHP code. Now the first example here is going to be a very simple for loop. And if you remember correctly, to open a for loop, we specify the for keyword. Then we have to add in the parameters or the conditions as well as things like the counter and so on. So let's go ahead and actually do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable over here, and keep in mind we have to treat this like a variable, which is going to be I, and I'm going to set this equal to 0. This is going to be the first initial value of my counter. And then I'm going to call I again, and I'm going to say that while I is equal to or less than 10, I want to do something. But before I do that, I'm simply just going to increment I as well. So I'll say plus plus. Great. Now, the next thing I need to do is open my curly brace. And inside my curly brace over here, this is the code that needs to be executed while this condition has not yet been met. That is to say that while I is still less than 10 or equal to 10, then keep doing this thing. So I'm going to say echo, and I'm going to say I is equal to, let's just add a bit of spacing and concatenation. I'll call my $I because I'm keeping track of this value, and then I will concatenate this with a break tag just in case we need to write additional code and move that onto a new line. Very, very important. Do not forget your colon at the end over here, else your code simply will not run. Let's save this and see what we get. So if I run my code now, I have I is equal to 0 up until I is equal to 10. So effectively, we have just incremented our values up until I is eventually equal to 10. Let's try something a little more complex. Now for this example, we are going to stick to using the for loop. The only difference here is that we're actually going to work with an array. Now, first things first, I need to create a valid array so that I can loop through that specific array. And that array is going to be called cars. And cars is equal to type of array, and I need to basically insert a list of items. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all the items that I want in this array, and I'll just paste that over here. So at index 0 we have Jaguar F type, at index 1 we have Supra, and at index 2 we have Porsche 911. Now that we have our array, we can actually go ahead and write our for loop. So I will say for, and I'll add my counter again, $I, which is equal to 0 once again, and then add my semicolon, $I, while I is equal to or less than 2, continue to do something, right? So I will then just say $I plus plus, because I want to make sure that I can increment this variable to satisfy the condition at some point, to avoid an infinite loop. Now in my curly brace over here, I need to insert the block of code that I want to run. So I'll say echo $cars at the index of whatever the counter happens to be at the time, and then I'll just concatenate that with a break tag in the event that we want something added to a new line. This just looks a lot cleaner. Then over here, I just want to make sure that I close off my statement. So let's review our code. We've got our array over here with 3 items with index 0 to 2, and we have our for loop over here that's going to run through this array and print out every car in my list. So let's save this up, head back over to our browser, let's refresh, and now we have a list of the 3 cars that we wanted to print out. That is Jaguar F-Type, Supra, and Porsche 911. Now there is a much easier way to do this as opposed to using all of these lines of code, and this is why we have the for each loop. So let's take a look at how the for each loop actually works. Now in order to achieve the same thing with a for each loop, I'm going to remove my for loop over here and I'm going to maintain that array. And the only difference here is that the for each loop is a little more effective in working with arrays. So we specify the for each keyword, we then open our curly brace of the code that we want to be executed, and you'll notice that this is a lot quicker and a lot more efficient. So I'll call my cars array and I'll use the keyword as, which is the value stored within this array. This value can be any value. You can give this any name basically. It does not have to be value. This could be something like car. In my case, I'm just going to call it value for the time being. And then over here, I'm going to echo out the pretty much the exact same statement. So I'll echo out value and I'll just add a break tag once again. So let's just add this in. Let's actually remove this, and we can add it to the end over here. Let's just clean up our code nicely, and let's make sure we've got everything inserted correctly. And I'll save this up. Let's review our code for a second. So we have a for each loop. We've got a variable called cars, which is this array over here that we created. And we have a new variable that we created, which is called value. And we're essentially just plugging in each of these values into value as we loop through this array. Wonderful. Let's refresh our code and see what we get. Now, if we refresh our code, we get the exact same result. Let's change this up quickly so we can actually see that this code is working and being executed properly. So let's change this one over here to BMW. And let's save that up. Head back over, refresh, and our code works just fine. Wonderful. So let's hop back into our code. And for our next example, we're going to try something a little more complex. So what exactly are we going to attempt with the next loop? The next loop we're going to work with is going to be the while loop. And again, this is not very complicated, but just bear with me for a second. So I'm going to remove all of this code over here, and I'm going to write a basic while loop. First, I'm going to create a variable called x, which is equal to 0, and this is going to be my counter. And I'll simply say that while, let's open up the correct parentheses and so on, while my variable x is less than 5, then simply just echo out some statement, which is going to be x is equal to, just add some colons over here, x is equal to x, and then just a break tag on the end. You'll notice that there are various ways of creating a break tag, so you don't necessarily have to stick to the one where you're concatenating. Okay, you can actually write your string out, because PHP will pick up that you are referencing a variable just by using the $sign over here. That's just something to keep in mind. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm incrementing x to avoid any sort of infinite loops. Okay, so essentially I created a variable called x outside of my loop. I then reference that in my while loop by saying that while x is equal to or less than 5, let's add an equal sign over here, then echo out this statement and then increment x and then run the statement again. Okay, so let's save this and see what we get. Also, we want to make sure we add our semicolon. Let's save, run through this, and we now have x is equal to 0 up until 5. Excellent. Now for our next loop, we are going to tackle the do while loop. So let's head back over to our script. And first thing is first, I'm going to remove all of my previous code. And now I'm going to create a variable called y, and I'll say this is equal to 6. Close this off, and now I'm going to open my do loop. And inside of here, you'll notice that instead of using normal parentheses, we're actually using the curly braces. Okay, so the reason for this is because I want this code to run at least once, regardless of whether the condition is true or not. That is the reason we use the do while loop. So I'll say echo y, let's add our quotation marks, y is equal to y, and then our break tag over here. And then always remember our semicolon. So let's save that up. And then I'm going to increment y over here. So I'll say y plus plus. And then after this, I'll add my block of code that allows you to check your condition. Okay, so this is going to be while I is equal to or less than 5. So let's add our colons, save this up, and let's refresh. Now, what exactly is happening here? Let me take a moment to explain. Now, perhaps you unconsciously thought that we are going to print the numbers 0 till 5 or 6 or whatever the case is. But I actually did this on purpose to prove a point. Let's revisit our code for a second. So if we hop back over to Atom, you'll notice that y is actually set equal to 6. So this condition over here says that while y is equal to or less than 5, then do this over here. And this is being done at least once, regardless of this condition being true over here. Okay, so that is the power of the do while loop. Regardless of our condition being satisfied or not, we will execute this block of code at least once. So it's quite important to understand the difference between the while loop and the for each loop and the do while loop. Wonderful. Now that we've completed all the loops, we can actually remove all of this code over here because we are going to start working with functions. And for consistency's sake, I'll change this to functions. Now, I'm going to create a very, very basic function at first. And this function is just going to print out some name. So we call the keyword function first of all, and then we give this function a name. And I'm going to say name gen for name generator. And then over here, I'm simply just going to call an echo statement that echoes out a name like Jack. Okay. Now, in order for this function to work, we actually have to go and call this function because it's all good and well creating the function, but the function must be called because the function is not automatically called when the function is created. So over here, I'm just going to call name gen. I'll include my parentheses, which is very, very important. And I'll head back over and I'll refresh. And now I have Jack. Now, what if we wanted to change this? What if we wanted a bit of flexibility here? We can do that by adding in parameters. So how do we do that? Now I'm going to keep this as name gen, and I'm going to delete this over here, and I'm going to pass in a variable here. And this is just going to be called name. So the idea here is that we can pass in any name instead of having a hard-coded name like Jack over here. So I can go and print something like Steve by simply including it as a parameter when I call the function. Remember, this is called a parameter, and a parameter is used as an input for the function to do some sort of work. So over here, I'm just going to say something like name. Okay. So when I call this function, I'm going to echo name, and name is going to be whatever the user passed in here. So when I call the function, I can pass in a string that says something like Steve, save this up, and I refresh my code, I now have Steve, and I can add in any name. This is the power of functions, is that we can use inputs and parameters to do some sort of computation instead of having some hard-coded values. Excellent. So we also mentioned that functions can often return some sort of value. How does this work? So I'm going to take this function over here, clean up my code, and I'm going to remove it. And I'm going to create a new function with the name of multiply. And this function takes in two parameters, which we'll sort out in a second. Let's just clean up our code, give it some spacing. This function takes in a parameter called num1 and a parameter called num2. Notice that I separate the amount of parameters simply by adding a comma. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new variable called result. And in this variable, I'm going to store the result of num1 multiplied by num2. Keep in mind that we use an asterisk in the event that we want to multiply two numbers. And then I'll close this off. So essentially, the user needs to pass in num1, num2, whatever that value is, and we'll store that in the result after we've multiplied num1 and num2. Fairly straightforward. And here comes in the return keyword. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to return the variable result. And by calling this function returns this value so we can do some sort of extra computations. Let's save this up. And at the bottom over here, I'm going to create a new variable called var. Let's add our $, and I'm going to set this equal to multiply. And I'm going to pass in the number 5 and 2. Okay. And then I'm simply just going to echo out var dot break tag. Okay. And I'll save that up. So let's head back over and refresh our code. So if we refresh this, we get 10. And that is expected because 5 multiplied by 2 is actually equal to 10. So let's review our code again. We created a function called multiply that takes in two parameters. We then created a local variable inside that function that stores the result of num1 multiplied by num2, and then we return the result. Okay, and then we created a variable, and the variable over here, or this variable called var, is able to actually store the result of this function's return statement. If we had not had this return statement, the functionality wouldn't be there. And then we simply just echoed out var, which is our variable over here. Pretty simple stuff. Now let's do one last example and let's try to mix things up a bit. Let's use a loop as well as an array combined with a function. So I'm going to get rid of all of this code over here and I'm going to start fresh by creating a new function. And this function is called array looper. As the name suggests, we are simply just going to loop through an array. And in order to do this, we want to supply an array as a parameter. So I'll just call this array. And do keep in mind, you can call this whatever you want. You don't have to call this array because this is simply just a variable or a parameter. So I'm going to say that for each, let's actually get rid of this and start from scratch. For each, open up my curly brace over here, array, which is that array that I just created, as value once again, then do something. And in this case, I'm just going to say echo my value and I'll add my break tag. Okay. And the next thing I need to do is I need to go and create a new array, because remember, we need an array as an input over here for this function to work. Keep in mind that this is also the function body. This is the code that gets executed inside of this function. So I'm going to copy over an array that I already have. And this array is simply just called fruits, which equals array of apple, orange, mango, and banana. And now all I have to do is simply just say array looper, which is effectively the equivalent of calling my array. Close this off. Also make sure I have everything else closed off correctly. And I'm going to say fruits is my parameter. Great, let's save this up and see what we get. So once I refresh, I have apple, orange, mango, as well as banana. So let's run through this one more time to get a better grasp of what's going on here. So I created this function called array looper, and this array takes in a parameter of array. Again, you can name this whatever you want. And then inside the function body, I just created a for each loop that takes that array and assigns each index to this variable called value, and then we echo out value on separate lines. So that's the building of my function. Okay, we still have to create my array over here, which is apple, orange, mango, and banana. It's called array. And then we call that array over here by supplying it with a variable fruits, which is this array that we created over here. So that's how we can mix and match all of these things to come up with really, really powerful components or functions for our programs. And that is basically it for today. In our next session, we'll cover everything regarding super globals in PHP, which can be really, really powerful, especially when paired with things such as forms and data collection and so on. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.